So today we can talk about something very unusual, a day when genuinely many people are celebrating in the Middle East. And often news coverage of anything in the Middle East is dominated by conflict, violence, upset, sadness, grief. And it's certainly been that way in the last couple of years as the conflict in Gaza has raged on. But today, within 24 hours, we expect to see the hostages, the remaining Israeli hostages, come home. Gazans we've seen on their way home to what's left of where they used to live. So a day to celebrate, but a day with huge challenges too.
And on that, we played some recordings from Hostage Square in Tel Aviv. And you can hear here the moment that the US president is cheered and the Israeli prime minister is booed.
To Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and to President Donald J. Trump.
But there was and is a massive sense of anticipation, people holding their breath while celebrating what's happened now, but what's next. So we'll get into all of that on this Sunday's episode of Newscast.
Hello, it's Paddy in the studio.
It's Laura in the studio.
And it's Henry at home.
Excellent. Lovely to have you with us, Henry. In a tank top, resplendent. So we will be focusing initially on the situation in the Middle East. So what we know today, some aid has started to go in. We've seen pictures of aid trucks moving into Gaza in the south. A senior Hamas official has confirmed that the return of hostages will start tomorrow morning. And we know also there's going to be a big international gathering. Far be it from international leaders to hang back to insert themselves into this story. There's going to be a big sort of summit kind of jamboree in Egypt tomorrow. And Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, I think, will both be attending, alongside, obviously, Israeli leaders, Middle Eastern leaders, and, of course, Donald Trump.
Yes. Henry, who asked to go? Did Keir Starmer ask to go, or did the US president say, please come?
I don't know for sure, but from some of the reporting I've seen out of America and out of Israel, it seems like the cast list is pretty wide, to be honest. And there's going to be quite a lot of world leaders there, including world leaders who wouldn't make the sorts of claims that the UK government is making to have been involved in the diplomacy which has led to this point. So I do think one of the questions, it is so far from the most important question for especially for those people in the Middle East, but also anyone who's just wanted a peaceful resolution to what is happening out there. But I do think a question for the coming days and weeks will be, to what extent did the UK's diplomacy help or hinder this, or was it just completely irrelevant? And I'm actually not sure that Keir Starmer's presence there tomorrow helps us answer that question.
I think that's right. And it is a bit of a sidebar. I mean, it does all feel like a sidebar in all of this, really. But I was intrigued, or I wouldn't say entertained, that's the wrong word to use, but I was intrigued when on Friday, when this was all very dramatically happening and there was some spin coming out of Number 10, that actually this was being compared to what the UK had achieved during the Good Friday Agreement because of the services of one Jonathan Powell, who had been in Egypt at the last minute. So I thought that was quite intriguing. I'm not quite sure if that is what really moved this particular mountain.
Yeah, and I take the point about the fact that we can do an episode on peace in the Middle East, but we are also a podcast that talks about politics. So we are allowed to talk about two things at the same time. And I think what people have told me on the airwaves is, hello, United Kingdom, you're completely irrelevant to what's been happening here. You've got a very disturbed national conversation about this with a polarised, angry street. You've achieved that in the UK, but your fingerprints are not on this peace deal. You're irrelevant. That's been what other people have said about our country.
Yeah, and there was a bit of a Barney about that on our programme this morning. So Nadine Dorries, now of Reform UK, formerly of the Conservative Party, was saying this has all been Trump. The UK's had nothing to do with it at all. But we were also joined by Valerie Amos, who was a Labour cabinet minister and who was a very senior UN diplomat. And she was making the point, in her view, actually the UK has been involved because this deal may have come to a conclusion because Donald Trump got it over the line. But actually, you have to think about all the hard work that's gone on over recent months, over the last couple of years. But I think also where you see the UK expertise in providing aid and things like that. Tom Fletcher, of course, the UN aid chief, is a former British official. So that may be where we see the UK playing more of a role in this next phase. But Bridget Phillipson, the government minister with us this morning, talked about what the UK might be able to do next.
Well, this, of course, is a massive step forward and very welcome. to see the ceasefire, to see more humanitarian aid getting in. And we hope and pray that within hours, the release of the remaining hostages back to their families in Israel. But this can only be the start of a process. We know that we need to see a viable Palestinian state alongside a safe and secure Israel. That's the government's position. That's what we want to continue to be involved in making happen, and why the Prime Minister Keir Starmer is tomorrow travelling to Egypt.
But does the UK really have a role here? I mean, it's very clear the difference here was American diplomacy working with Middle Eastern countries here. Does the UK really have a role?
We do have a role, but of course the role of the US has been critical in this. We can all recognise that.
So, Henry, back to you. It's you who raised this. We must remember what is happening on the ground. 500,000 Gazans on the move north. Israeli hostage families celebrating in Hostage Square a huge international summit. And Jeremy Byrne telling Laura on the TV and us on the radio, this is a moment of hope. This is a moment of celebration.
Yeah, it clearly feels very different, even to my untrained eye, to the much briefer ceasefires that we've had since October the 7th, 2023, especially the one in January, which sort of coincided with the transition between the Biden White House and the Trump White House. It is clear that all sides are treating it as something that is likely to become much more permanent. Yeah. Obviously, that still means there are big questions to come about the nature of that permanent ceasefire and whether it actually blossoms into a permanent peace.
Yeah, and I want to just take the lead from you, because you did say if we did talk about the process, we risked not talking about the ground. So we are talking about both. And I want to tell you what we did on Radio 4. We heard from Imad Kudair in the south of Gaza, who pointed out that there is this lack of drone noise over his house. And you'll hear here, in the most difficult of circumstances, as Henry said at the top, this is someone in Gaza telling us why they are believing in this moment.
Nowadays, we can sleep with a very big quietness here in the atmosphere. No planes, no drones. So we started right now to live a new life, which we can visit our family members. We can walk in the streets of Al-Mawasi here, the west of Khan Yunis, with no fears inside our hearts. But the bad thing is that everything related to the east part of Khan Yunis is diminished, is destroyed. So that place, for example, my village of Khuza'an, is totally destroyed. You cannot find even the one house. But what happened cannot be undone. I think that we have the enough power in order to rebuild it again and make it great again.
But isn't that so simple and yet so powerful, actually? The senses, a noise that you live with, that constant backdrop, the hum of drones or the fear of planes overhead or the sound of gunfire, that has stopped. And, it's often a metaphor, isn't it? Oh, yes, the guns fell silent. Here we are in 2025, being able, actually, with the privilege of technology, we can hear from eyewitnesses directly as this thing is unfolding. Also, Israeli families have been talking to us too. We spoke to Omri, whose mother and father were taken hostage on October the 7th. Omri Lifshitz is one of the many family members who's been in Hostages Square. We've both spoken before very movingly to his sister, Sharon Lishvitz, who's here in London, but he was in Tel Aviv yesterday, and this is what he told us about what this moment represents for his family.
My mother said she's feeling that she's been released, but she's still in captivity until they all return.
What's this moment like for families still waiting for the return of their loved ones?
The live one, all of them were supposed to return, so they're really happy, and you can feel it. They start smiling. People we never saw smile because we didn't know them before the 7th of October. But now they're still smiling. People with kids over there and parents and brothers. But the one with the murder one, they really hope that they all return. And it's like a mixed situation. They're happy for the one that's returning and really waiting to see if their relative will return.
And Omri, what would you say to the leaders on all sides of this who have to make this work in the long term?
Ending the war, never get them to fight in Gaza, build Gaza back, bring all the humanitarian, build the place and bring it back to a very good place for the people of Gaza. I don't care about the Hamas, what's up, I hope they will not return. And I hope they're going to finish also the war in the western territories in Israel, the occupied territories, and we start living in a peace place. This agreement is agreement with Hamas. It's not a peace agreement. I hope they keep going for peace agreement, because peace you're doing between nation and nation or people and people. So that's what I hope, that we'll never fight again.
And I think it's right today to really absorb those voices of people whose lives have been turned upside down, who've suffered. Omri's father he died in captivity. His mum came home safe, but he's one of the people who lost a family member to that dreadful event on October the 7th. But then also to hear the hope and the relief in the voice of Imad that you spoke to, who's in Gaza. And I think it's absolutely right today. Maybe I'm sounding terribly self-indulgent, but we just sort of absorb really what the effect these huge days of Donald Trump's sort of, dynastic diplomacy, those effects that has had on people's lives. Of course, there are huge complications ahead. We touched on it with Jeremy Bone a bit yesterday, actually, on the podcast, didn't we? Who's going to run Gaza? Who's going to be in charge of security? The BBC reported yesterday at a different clan going and fighting with Hamas. There's already a battle over who's to be in control of the streets. What will Hamas's role be in the future? How quickly can people in Gaza get the medical care and attention that they need? How quickly can they properly get food in to people who've been on the brink of starvation? And ultimately, is the idea that a board of peace with Donald Trump sitting at the chair, is that a realistic prospect for this troubled part of the world?
And Tony Blair, Henry, do we brace for Tony Blair?
Yeah, very possibly. I mean, he's the only other named person on this board of peace, provisional though it may be. I mean, I was very struck, Laura, by the consensus on your programme. Sure, they disagreed on the extent to which UK diplomacy had or had not played a role in the run-up to this, but basically everyone agreed that Donald Trump did this. And I do think we should just take a second to note that it is Donald Trump, who had no heritage in politics or diplomacy, who was the presenter of The Apprentice, who has managed to do this. And I think it is, one in the eye for the credentialed diplomatic classes of the world and of politics who appear on, outlets like ours and say what world leaders should do. And a man who defies conventional wisdom at every turn is the man who has achieved this. And I think basically everyone on your programme agreed on that implicitly.
They did,
but
yeah.
There is a question now over whether he sort of banks it as a big achievement, hopes he wins the Nobel Peace Prize 2026 and moves on to other things, not least the domestic concerns which got him elected, a president who said he didn't want to focus on foreign wars, or whether he actually maintains this energy and focus on this issue as those sort of thornier questions of what the peace looks like
or indeed
begin to open up.
Or indeed somebody, a senior person, said it to me yesterday, the hope but among them and some of their counterparts was that Donald Trump will now take a vigorous focus to Ukraine. So if he's willing to talk tough with Netanyahu and Hamas, is he willing to do the same to Vladimir Putin? But, we're maybe getting ahead of ourselves.
Well,
but I think it's right, Henry. It's one of those moments where people go, well, hang on a minute. The experts, to misquote Michael Gove from many years ago, the experts and many people who predicted that Donald Trump's approach would be disastrous for diplomacy. It would be terrible. He would blunder around and everything would crash and become much worse. Actually, in this moment, with all those things unresolved in the weeks and months ahead, he is the one who's being given the credit.
Yeah, and there's a cartoon on one of the front pages of the Sunday broadsheets of someone tying themselves in knots saying Trump did it. He obviously didn't want to have to admit it. So Henry's put that into one sentence, really. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is that Zelensky himself has drawn the parallel. So we're not getting ahead of what people are saying. People are saying that,
yes,
including the president of Ukraine.
Right. So if Donald Trump thinks actually now I'm going to enjoy this success of being a successful, powerful, dynastic diplomat, it was extraordinary also to see the family there, to see Jared Kushner and his daughter there with state, this is a family business. Maybe he'll get a taste for this.
And also, Henry, this is a British Prime Minister who has attached himself and his international record to the White House.
Yeah, that's right. And yet diverged with the White House in the last few months on how to approach what was happening between Israel and Hamas. I mean, Donald Trump did not get as publicly angry about the UK decision to recognise Palestine as some had anticipated he would. But nevertheless, that was a clear divergence, I think, especially, frankly, under pressure from Labour MPs and Labour cabinet ministers from Keir Starmer. He had had a strategy for his first year or so in office with, tying himself to the White House, not just generally, but specifically on this issue. They diverged. And I think coincidentally, rather than as a consequence, but coincidentally, around about the moment they diverged, Donald Trump managed to fix it himself.
OK, so we've done some friction between the US and the UK, and let's move, but there's still friction between the US and the UK over a China row.
Yes, so newscasters, clever bunch that you are, will have noticed this story, which has been rumbling on for a while. A case accusing two young British men of spying on behalf of China in Parliament collapsed recently, because the Crown Prosecution Service said they didn't have evidence that China was an enemy, so they couldn't go ahead with the case. It was a huge shock because inside government and outside government, the view was, well, all the evidence was there. This case was a slam dunk, as it had been described in some quarters. Today, the Sunday Times, who's been leading on this story recently, says that the White House are riled about what's gone on here. We know how much Donald Trump is focused on the threat from China. China. He always talks about China. And it appears that what's happened here has not gone unnoticed in Washington, D.C. So that's the latest sort of wrinkle in what is becoming, I think, Henry, really quite a troublesome story for the government. Yeah,
I think as Parliament returns tomorrow, which it does after its mini break for the party conferences, I think we're going to hear a lot more about this. It's a complicated story. And I think actually in a funny way in terms of how to manage this, that helps the government because there are various areas which are just quite hard to understand. But the problem for the government is that this case being dropped is quite hard to understand. And, the explanation given by Keir Starmer on his way to India to travelling journalists there was that the only thing that matters here, everything else is extraneous. The only thing that matters is how the previous Conservative government considered China formally not to be a threat at the time of these alleged offences, which were then dropped in 2022 and 2023. There are various lawyers who say that is not the case. That is not the right legal test. Obviously, Keir Starmer himself is a distinguished lawyer. But I think that argument over whether the actions of Keir Starmer's government affected this case or not, I think is going to have to play out. And I think, members of the government are going to have to engage with it more seriously and probably before Parliament.
But we've also seen a new Kemi Badenoch at Prime Minister's Question Time. We've said here before, her performance was so dismal, it was thought that her questions were being written by the Labour Party at one time. So she's had that track record. Then she's completely responsible in the eyes of some supporters for getting the resignation sacking of Peter Mandelson with her questions.
So she very much sharpened up her PMQ's act.
So we come now to the return of Parliament with the return of some pencil lead to Kemi Badenoch's PMQ's performance. And although this is complicated, it does come down to the oldest question in public life, which is, what did you know, Prime Minister, and when did you know it?
Which you helpfully remind us of, because actually the big headline of this story is not that complicated. And I think, as Henry implied, government has been hiding would be very pejorative. It has been easier for the government to fend off some questions because of the complexities in this. But boil down the story is this. The accusation is that the government, through the National Security Advisor, Jonathan Powell, dropped this case because they didn't want to make the Chinese angry. That's basically the allegation. It's denied. Minister said it had nothing to do with them. Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, said this morning in a very clear way, this had nothing to do with Jonathan Powell whatsoever, which the Prime Minister didn't say at a press conference a couple of days ago. But then moments later, Priti Patel, who was the Home Secretary, who knows a lot about how the Chinese threat works, she essentially says that the government's case is absolute hokum.
I was Home Secretary for over 3 years, and we were absolutely crystal clear that China was a threat, an adversary, and I led a lot of our national security operations around China and all the details on that. I think the government has to account for the position that it's taken, and it's pretty obvious now that there was political interference when it came to the collapse of that trial.
There's lots of people who would say that privately too. There's been evidence for years that China's a threat. You can actually spend 30 seconds on Google and find people like the boss of MI5 saying at least since 2022 that China presents significant threats to the UK.
I visited a military base for work, And certain Chinese-made software in cars means that some brands of cars are banned from getting in the car park of our military bases.
Right.
The people at the centre of this trial deny any wrongdoing.
They do.
But I wonder, Henry, about the role of Jonathan Powell. He's come into the papers today a lot. The focus is on him having been brought back. He's a figure from the new Labour era, is he not? And also we heard of his role in the Good Friday, the Belfast Agreement, bringing peace to Northern Ireland. So he's well known, but he was brought back by Keir Starmer, one of those people from Labour's recent past. Is he facing questions this week?
Yeah, an awful lot of questions, because there is a view, fairly or otherwise, but especially from the Conservative Party, that he is at the heart of all of this. Although, as Laura says, Bridget Phillipson, I think, hardened up the denial of Jonathan Powell's role in an interesting way today. But yeah, I mean, he's a very unusual figure. He's a special advisor, a SPAD, as they're known, and most SPADs in Downing Street and certainly beyond government, throughout government, are in their 30s, perhaps their 40s. You know, Jonathan Powell is nearly 70. He was Tony Blair's chief of staff for a decade. After he and Blair left Downing Street, he spent years across the world as a sort of conflict resolution mediator expert, dealing with some of the most, hard-edged, shall we say, people of different types all around the world. And now he's back. He's at the heart of government. He has all the authority which that experience confers. And yet some people in Downing Street find his decisions, I think the more political people in Downing Street sort of fear that he's become too much of a diplomat and not enough of a sort of political strategist in the way that perhaps he used to be when he was Tony Blair's chief of staff, and that some of these decisions are quite hard to defend politically. I mean, most especially that was true of the sort of Chagos Islands. I think this one is a bit more complicated because, it's still not really clear the extent or nature of his involvement.
That's right. And the other thing to say, I think, about him and why the Conservatives, I think, are licking their lips at the chance to go after him is that foreign policy has been seen for many months to be the bit that Keir Starmer's actually been quite good at. And that's often partly attributed to Jonathan Powell's wisdom and capabilities and the way in which he's been able to grip foreign policy and send Keir Starmer around the world and show him taking a leading role when it comes to Ukraine, for example, and wrangling the relationship with the White House in a successful way that other countries haven't managed. So that's why going after Jonathan Powell from a political point of view is a very tempting target from the Prime Minister's critics who would seek to do his government damage.
Well, and I think also if Jonathan Powell were here, and I don't know what he would say because he hasn't said anything in public since he took this role because
the
he's
invitation
a special
is open, Jonathan. If you happen to be a newscaster, anytime.
Capability Powell.
But I think, what he would say probably is foreign policy has been a success for Keir Starmer because he has approached it with a serious regard for international law and a serious regard for the importance of having broader diplomatic goals and not letting them be derailed by individual clusters of newspaper headlines. I think there is just a sort of difference in how he would approach government to perhaps some of the other people in his team. Also, by the way, we ended the last segment by talking about Ukraine. One area where I think many people do say that Jonathan Powell has been integral, not just to what the British government is doing, but to what the broader Western alliance is doing, is Ukraine, where he's been very involved. He was very involved after that extraordinary bust-up between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office. He was very involved in putting that relationship back together, I think with a fair degree of success.
And also, I mean, this is an age-old argument of how much are we meant to flatter the Americans. I mean, when I was a student in the 20th century, people were very actively saying then we can't just be a floating aircraft carrier. We can't just be the poodle of America. It's perfectly appropriate for the British government to diverge with the US government over some issues out of 100 issues.
And the same question applies, though, to China.
Yes.
How much can you be a flatterer and how much can you be a foe? And given that we have these two now massive economic superpowers, it's a huge question of principle for any UK government. And you've seen this sort of under Osborne and Cameron. It's like, golden era, friendly. And I've bored everybody before with our stories about going on various trips with George Osborne and other prime ministers to China as they tried to make friends. Then the approach pull back a little bit and then get a little bit friendlier and then pull back a bit. And this sort of, this waxing and waning of the UK's relationships as a sort of medium-sized power, they're absolutely critical questions to the success or failures of governments in this country. But if we, were for a second to give our politicians a tiny smidgen of sympathy, it's really, really hard to get the balance right on this.
And there's it comes together in one building, which is the Royal Mint in the capital in London, which is being in a planning row about becoming the new massive super embassy, which is being held up in all sorts of wrangling about whether it should do, whether it shouldn't do. And I haven't heard your programme, but so we can, all of us now, hear what some of the political reaction has been to the collapse of this case, which we were reminded about. There's going to be big questions this week. This is Bridget Phillips from Talking for the Government about the collapse of the China spy case.
We are deeply disappointed that the case hasn't proceeded. These date back to events in 2023, so this did take place under the previous government. Obviously, the Crown Prosecution Service are best placed to explain why they were not able to bring forward a prosecution. But what I can be absolutely clear about is that ministers and others, including the National Security Advisor, had no role to play in either the substance of the case or the evidence in question. And evidential questions are matters for the Crown Prosecution Service.
Well, the Crown Prosecution Service boss took the extraordinary step of saying in the public domain that he didn't have the evidence because the government refused to give it to him, even though people like the boss of MI5 have been saying 4 years again in public that China is a threat.
So we are clear that China presents threats, challenges and also opportunities. We have to be clear-eyed about that. But what will always come first is our national security as a nation. Yes, there are trading opportunities that come in terms of our work with China, a major economy, but what will always matter most is the national security of this country.
And the National Security Advisor, Jonathan Powell, there's been a lot of fingers being pointed at him. Can you say with confidence today that he was not involved in any discussions about the evidence being presented in this case?
What I can say today, to be absolutely clear, is that he was not involved in the substance of the case, in discussions around that, or the evidence connected to the case. I can give you that reassurance. He did not have those conversations around the substance or the evidence of the case. These are matters for the relevant authorities, the Crown Prosecution Service, and they date back to 2023. And I'm not making a partisan point when I say this, but there was a different government in office then, and a different legal framework. The law has since changed. We now have the National Security Act, and that is materially relevant.
Bookmark that phrase. Jonathan Powell was not involved in the substance or discussion of the evidence. And it's interesting when you hear a minister use the same phrase several times. She started off saying, and actually offered this, he wasn't involved in the substance or the evidential process. And you think, that is a phrase that has been carefully prepared. And maybe quite rightly a phrase carefully prepared because it's a serious subject and she must have known she was going to face questions about it this morning.
Yes,
she stuck to that phrase very, very carefully.
It has triggered the political Marple in you, I can tell. Henry, has it triggered the political Poirot in you, this language?
Sure. Well, I mean, almost anything MPs do. But I think I'm not going to get them all in. I wish I could get them all in a room like Poirot at the end of an episode or end of a book, I should say.
Is there some lingo bingo to play here?
Well, yes, but I think actually the big question for the coming days is whether MPs are going to get the chance to play lingo bingo or any other games, serious or otherwise, with Jonathan Powell. Because we're being told that he is offering himself up for a private evidence session with MPs. I increasingly don't think that one's going to be sustainable. On any issue, MPs get especially bolshy if they feel their rights to parliamentary scrutiny are being denied. And look, there is a reason why it's a bit complicated with him, which is that unusually he's a special advisor. He's the first special advisor to be a national security advisor rather than a government official. And special advisors don't generally give public testimony to select committees, but national security advisors have historically given testimony to select committees. But I increasingly think that Jonathan Powell is going to have to find a way to answer these questions before MPs in public. Otherwise, the row is going to only hot up, I think.
Someone suggested to me the really mischievous thing to do would be to force him to appear at a session at the same time as the head of the Crown Prosecution Service, who's the person who's gone public extraordinarily to say they wouldn't give me the evidence, have a joint session with them both sitting side by side to try to get to the bottom of what really happened.
Yes,
but I think that's probably quite unlikely.
Do you? And that's when Parliament comes alive in the eyes of many parliamentarians, when you do the job of scrutiny.
Doing the job of scrutiny is what they do, and doing the job of scrutiny and accountability is also what we do. I'm just wondering, and maybe we should ask newscasters for an answer, but if I'm Marple and Henry's Poirot, are you, I don't know, Bergerac? I'm sure John Nettles loved a suede boot, although there is a new Bergerac, I think.
Yes, it's coming. Thank
I don't know, it might have been on, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe I could be Morse.
John Thaw. No, you will, John. A bit of the old Barrington Furlong.
Yeah, it's nice. It's a nice game. I wish I hadn't started it now because I'm going to come out of this very badly, faced with you two.
Newscasters, let us know. Which
sleuth.
detective should Paddy be?
I was once an extra in Endeavour, which is the Morse prequel. I spent all morning in makeup, and then about half of my left nostril appeared on screen.
But
I was very proud
what
of
a
that.
nostril!
Is that what gave you a taste for the silver screen?
Exactly.
Now, here you are on the airwaves gracing us daily these days. Who'd have known?
I feel this is a sign it's the end. When we talk about Henry's nostril, it must mean the newscast has limped to a conclusion.
Well, I hope Sophia didn't limp to a conclusion. Sophia is a newscaster. Hello, I'm about to run my first half marathon, the Oxford half marathon, so hopefully no limping. Fueled completely by newscast. I only got into running this year, so I've had to wait to accumulate episodes so I can run the whole race. Listening exclusively to newscast. Thank you. I've saved 5 episodes just in case. Are starting with Wednesday's episode. So, God, if you've stayed with us till Sunday, Sophia, congratulations.
Yes, 5 newscasts equals half a marathon.
Half your life.
Henry, we'll say goodbye to you, looking ahead as you have done to the week ahead. Have a lovely Sunday.
Goodbye, Bergerac.